The cemetery was silent, except for the soft rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. The billionaire, Richard Coleman, had visited his son's grave countless times. Yet today, something was different. As he walked along the familiar path, his eyes fell upon a small figure sitting beside the tombstone, a boy, no older than 10, holding a tattered diary in his hands. Richard stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. Who was this child, and why was he here, reading from what looked like an old, worn-out book? Curiosity and unease intertwined in his chest as he slowly approached. The boy, oblivious to his presence, turned a page and whispered words only he could hear. Then, suddenly, he looked up, his eyes filled with something Richard hadn't seen in a long time: grief. Little did he know, the truth behind this moment would change his life forever. Richard took a deep breath and stepped closer. The boy finally noticed him and hesitated, gripping the diary tightly as if protecting a precious secret. His eyes darted between Richard and the gravestone, his small fingers trembling against the worn pages. "Who are you?" Richard asked, his voice gentler than he expected. The boy hesitated before whispering, I'm Ethan." He glanced at the diary, then back at Richard. I didn't mean to intrude. I come here to read." Richard's gaze shifted to the book in the boy's hands. The cover was faded, the edges frayed from years of handling. Something about it felt familiar, eerily so. A sudden chill ran down his spine. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his tone more urgent now. Ethan bit his lip. He hesitated, then lowered his head. "It was your son's. I found it in an old bookstore downtown." Richard's breath caught in his throat. That was impossible. His son, Oliver, had passed away years ago. And with him, all the memories Richard thought had been buried. The diary. It had been lost, vanished without a trace. His hands clenched. "That diary belonged to my son?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes, and I think it was meant for me to find." A strange silence settled between them. Richard's mind raced, searching for logic, for reason, but deep down, something told him this was no coincidence. "Why do you say that?" Richard finally asked. Ethan hesitated before turning to a bookmarked page. He held out the diary, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because he wrote about me before he even knew I existed." Richard stared at the boy, his heart pounding in his chest. The words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken truth. He reached for the diary, his fingers trembling, as he read the first few lines, his vision blurred with shock. It was his son's handwriting, and what was written on the page sent chills down his spine. Richard's fingers trembled as he traced the familiar handwriting. His son's words, written years ago, now stared back at him like a message from beyond. "One day, a boy will find this diary. He will be lost, just like I was. But if he reads this, maybe he won't feel so alone. Maybe he'll know that someone, somewhere, understands him." Richard's breath hitched. His mind struggled to make sense of what he was reading. How could Oliver have written about a boy he had never met? A boy who was sitting right in front of him now. eyes wide with quiet sadness? Ethan watched Richard's reaction carefully. I don't understand it either, he admitted, but everything he wrote, it feels like he was talking to me. Like he knew me before I was even born. Richard swallowed hard, flipping through the pages. The entries weren't just random thoughts, they were personal. They spoke of loneliness, of searching for meaning, of hoping that someone, someday, would read these words and feel understood. His son had been reaching out to someone, and now, that someone was here. Richard took a shaky breath. How did you find this diary? Ethan hesitated, then spoke softly. I was at the bookstore with my mom. She can't afford new books. So we go to second-hand stores sometimes. He glanced down at the diary. I wasn't looking for anything special. But this book, it was just sitting there. Like it was waiting for me. Richard's chest tightened. His mind raced with questions. How had Oliver's diary ended up in some old bookstore? And why did this boy, of all people, find it? Ethan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. The first time I opened it, I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. Richard stared at him, his heart aching. He had spent years drowning in grief, believing he had lost every piece of his son. Yet, here was this boy, holding Oliver's words like a lifeline. A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, rustling the trees around them. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the gravestone. Richard knelt beside Ethan, his voice softer now. Tell me, what else did my son write? Ethan hesitated for a moment, then carefully turned to another page. He ran his fingers over the words, as if they were something fragile, something sacred. Then, he began to read. And what he said next would change everything Richard thought he knew. Ethan took a deep breath and began reading. His voice was soft, yet every word felt like an echo from the past. If you're reading this, I hope you understand, life is strange. Sometimes, we meet people we are meant to meet, even if we don't know why. And sometimes, even when we're gone, we leave behind pieces of ourselves for others to find. Richard felt a lump form in his throat. Oliver had always been introspective, wise beyond his years. But these words, they felt eerily prophetic. Ethan glanced at Richard before flipping to another passage. His small fingers hovered over the page before he read aloud again. I dreamt of a boy. He's younger than me, but I know him somehow. He feels like a shadow of my own loneliness. In my dream, he's sitting alone, reading my words, and I want to tell him, he is not alone. A shiver ran down Richard's spine. He stared at Ethan, who was gripping the diary tightly, his knuckles turning white. That's me, Ethan whispered. I know it sounds crazy, but I think he was talking about me. Richard's heart pounded. He had spent years drowning in grief, believing his son's presence had faded from the world. But here was a boy, a stranger, connected to Oliver in a way he couldn't explain. His voice barely above a whisper. Richard asked, Ethan, why did you really come here today? The boy hesitated, then looked down. Because I don't have a dad, he admitted. He left before I was born. And my mom. She works all the time just to take care of me." He swallowed hard. "I never had anyone to talk to. But then, I found this book, and it felt like someone was finally listening." Richard felt his chest tighten. He had spent years mourning his son, never imagining that Oliver's words could bring comfort to someone else. A heavy silence filled the air between them. The sun had almost disappeared beyond the horizon, casting long shadows across the graveyard. Then, Ethan spoke again, barely above a whisper. "I think Oliver wanted me to find you," he said, "and I think he wanted you to find me." Richard felt a tear slip down his cheek. For the first time in years, the weight of loss didn't feel so crushing. Because maybe, just maybe, Oliver was still here, in his words, in this boy, in the unexpected ways life brought people together. And in that moment, Richard knew, this meeting was not a coincidence. This was fate. Richard wiped the tear from his cheek, his mind spinning with emotions he hadn't felt in years. Grief, hope, disbelief, all tangled together in a way he couldn't explain. He looked at Ethan, this small boy who had somehow become a bridge between the past and the present. "Ethan," he said gently, "would you let me read more?" Ethan hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He handed over the diary with great care, as if it were something sacred. Richard's hands trembled as he turned the pages, searching for something, anything, that might explain this impossible connection. And then, he found it. A passage dated just weeks before Oliver had passed away. The ink was slightly smudged, as if his son had been crying when he wrote it. "I have this feeling, like I won't be here for much longer. But I'm not scared. I just hope that when I leave, I don't leave nothing behind. I want my words to reach someone who needs them. Someone who feels lost. Someone who needs to know they're not alone." Richard inhaled sharply. The words felt like they were meant for this exact moment. This exact boy sitting beside him. Ethan, noticing Richard's reaction, whispered, "There's more." Richard turned to the next page. This time, Oliver's handwriting was shakier, more hurried. "Dad, if you ever find this, please don't be sad. I know you're going to miss me. But there's something I need you to do. One day, you'll meet someone who needs you. Someone like me. And when you do, don't be afraid to let them in." The book nearly slipped from Richard's hands. His chest ached as he clutched it tightly. Oliver had known. Somehow, he had known that this moment would come. Ethan looked up at Richard with wide, hopeful eyes. Maybe this is what he meant," he said softly. "Maybe you were meant to find me. Just like I was meant to find this book." Richard couldn't speak. The weight of his son's words. The presence of this boy who had walked into his life like a missing puzzle piece. It was all too much. But in that moment, he felt something shift. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in his grief. He reached out and placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I think you're right." His voice was thick with emotion. "And if Oliver wanted me to find you, then I won't ignore it." Ethan's lips quivered, as if he were holding back tears. "Does that mean I can come visit again?" Richard let out a soft, Broken chuckle. Ethan, you can visit anytime you want. The boy smiled, small at first, then brighter, and for the first time in years, Richard felt something warm bloom in his heart. Hope. And as they sat there, side by side in the fading light, Richard knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new. The sky had darkened, the last rays of sunlight dipping behind the trees. But neither Richard nor Ethan moved. They sat together in silence, bound by something neither of them could fully explain. After a moment, Richard let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ethan, do you live nearby? Ethan nodded slowly. Not too far. My mom and I live in a small apartment downtown. He hesitated, then added, she doesn't know I come here. Richard raised an eyebrow. She doesn't? Ethan shook his head. She's always busy with work. And I didn't think she'd understand. He looked down at the diary in his hands. But when I read Oliver's words, it felt like I had to be here. Like he was leading me here. Richard's chest tightened. He had spent years questioning why his son had been taken from him. Why life had felt so unbearably cruel. But now, sitting beside this boy who had been drawn to Oliver's words, it felt like, maybe, there had been a reason after all. Do you think your mom would let you visit me? Richard asked, surprising even himself with the question. Ethan's eyes widened. Visit you? Richard nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Yeah, I mean, if you want to. You said you don't have a dad. And, well, I don't have a son anymore. His voice wavered slightly, but he pushed forward. Maybe we could keep each other company. Ethan's face lit up with something Richard hadn't seen before, hope. Really? Really? Richard reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and handed it to the boy. Give this to your mom. Tell her I'd love to meet her and explain everything. Ethan held the card as if it were something precious, his fingers gripping it tightly. I will, he promised. Richard glanced back at Oliver's grave, the pain in his heart shifting into something different, something lighter. He wasn't sure if it was fate, or something beyond his understanding. But he knew one thing for certain, his son had led Ethan to him for a reason. And this time, he wouldn't ignore it. As they stood up, Richard placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Come on, I'll walk you home. Ethan beamed up at him. And for the first time in years, Richard didn't feel lost. He felt like he had found something. Someone worth holding on to. And maybe, just maybe, Oliver had known all along. As Richard and Ethan walked down the quiet path away from the cemetery, a sense of peace settled over them. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. And for the first time in a long while, Richard felt like he wasn't walking alone. Ethan clutched the diary to his chest, glancing up at Richard from time to time as if to make sure this was real, that this man, who had once been a stranger, was now someone who cared. So, what was Oliver like? Ethan finally asked, breaking the silence. Richard smiled faintly. He was kind, thoughtful, always looking out for others, even when he was the one struggling. His voice grew softer. "I think he would have liked you." Ethan's face lit up, a mixture of pride and sadness in his eyes. "I wish I could have met him." Richard exhaled deeply. "In a way, I think you already have." Ethan didn't say anything, but he hugged the diary a little tighter. As they reached the city streets, Richard saw Ethan's apartment complex, an old, run-down building with flickering streetlights outside. The neighborhood was quiet, but Richard could see the struggle in the peeling paint, the rusted balconies, the broken steps leading up to the entrance. Ethan shifted awkwardly. "It's not much," he mumbled. Richard shook his head. "Home isn't about how it looks. It's about who's waiting inside." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "My mom's probably home now." Richard knelt beside him. "Think she'd be okay if I came up and introduced myself?" Ethan bit his lip, then slowly nodded. "Yeah, I think she'd want to know why I come here." Together, they climbed the stairs, each step feeling like a bridge between the past and the future. And as Richard knocked on the door, he knew this wasn't just about Oliver anymore. It was about moving forward, about healing, and most of all, about finding family in the most unexpected places. The door in front of them opened, revealing a tired yet gentle-looking woman. She seemed startled for a moment when she saw Richard standing next to her son. "Ethan?" Her voice carried a hint of worry. "Who is this?" Ethan pressed his lips together, glancing at Richard before turning back to his mother. "Mom, this is Mr. Richard. I need to tell you something." The woman eyed Richard cautiously. As a single mother, her instincts made her wary of strangers entering her son's life. But when she noticed the diary in Ethan's hands, her gaze softened. "Can we talk for a moment?" Richard asked, his voice warm and sincere. She looked at Ethan once more, then nodded and stepped aside, allowing them to enter the small apartment. It was modest but clean, with a few old photographs on the walls and some well-worn toys neatly arranged in a corner. Richard sat across from her while Ethan stayed close to his mother, still holding Oliver's diary tightly. Taking a deep breath, Richard began to tell the whole story, about Oliver, about the diary, about how Ethan had found it, and about their strange yet fateful meeting at the grave. He spoke of Oliver's written words, of the feeling that none of this was a coincidence. The woman sat in silence, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. When Richard finally finished, she looked at her son with deep affection before turning back to him. "Ethan has never had a father in his life," she said softly. "I've always worried that he would feel alone. But I never imagined he would find someone like you. In this way." Richard swallowed the lump in his throat. "I don't want to disrupt your lives, but I truly believe Oliver wanted me to find Ethan. And I can't ignore that." She studied him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, smiled. "Maybe this really is fate." Ethan squeezed his mother's hand, his eyes filled with hope. "So, can I see Mr. Richard again?" His mother let out a small, warm chuckle, gently ruffling his hair. "If he wants to." Richard didn't hesitate. "Of course. If Ethan wants, I'll always be here." A warmth spread through the small apartment. A new bond had been formed, not by blood, but by memories, understanding, and a promise written long ago. That night, as Richard stepped out of the apartment, he felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. Under the vast, starry sky, he looked up, as if searching for something, or someone. And though there was no answer, he knew in his heart that Oliver was somewhere, smiling. Because in the end, the boy's wish in the diary had come true. And now, no one was alone anymore.